6 years ago, I had to travel to the town of Donora for work. Although I'd been through most of the surrounding neighborhoods, I'd never actually driven into Donora, and having some time to kill before a scheduled appointment, I decided to walk around on the main street. And that's where I saw a museum whose sole purpose was smog, but not just the ever-present smog that drapes cities like Los Angeles. This was a particular lingering of particulates. It was a fatal 5-day affair whose effects appear to persist to this day. And every block I walked that day had a handbill somewhere proclaiming that clean air started here, less than 30 minutes south of Pittsburgh, along the Monongahela River, is the birthplace of smog. I stared into a window where there was a quote from W. Michael McCabe, a regional administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. The quote read, "Before there was an Environmental Protection Agency, before there was an Earth Day, before Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, there was Donora." The Pittsburgh area is not new to smog. It still holds the stigma of being the smoky city. During the first half of the 20th century, it was not unusual for street lamps to be on early in the afternoon to aid the eye in cutting through the smoke and ash. In fact, it was fairly common practice for bartenders, barbers, and other such workers to bring 2 shirts to work with them each day in order so that they could change midday from the shirt that would have become grimy from the ever-present soot that clung to everything and snuck into buildings through the slightest means. Prior to the First World War, there had been attempts to limit air pollution, but those ordinances were short-lived. And it wasn't before long Pittsburgh was recognized as the most polluted city in the United States. I don't believe there was any other contenders. Following the conclusion of World War II, iconic 4-term Democratic mayor of Pittsburgh and future 37th governor of Pennsylvania, David L. Lawrence, set about trying to realize one of several new visions for the city. This new vision, which has since become known to a select few who care as Pittsburgh's first Renaissance, pushed for cleaner air. David Lawrence had a partner in Richard Mellon, the financier of note and Republican stalwart. The argument they made was obvious. Cleaner air meant cleaner, healthier living. The international attention that the small town of Donora received would help enable the environmental ordinances which had failed half a century prior. The smog began to settle in by October 26, 1948. Within a couple days, people began to talk about the strangeness of this particular yellow fog as it lingered, never lifting. By the 28th, some of the more elderly residents and asthmatics began experiencing respiratory problems. Oxygen tanks were delivered to some, but many others were hospitalized. Street lamps burned through the day as people felt their way through town. Some people, any that had health problems, were being advised to find a way out of town if they could. The Donora Zinc Works, which produce zinc, obviously, they also produce cadmium and sulfuric acid and lead byproducts. They continued operation even as scores of townspeople, including plant employees, began to get sick as the fog continued to hang over the town, thickening every hour. It seemed as though the sky were a stagnant pool of smoke and ash, and it was. Though most everybody was unaware of it at the time, the residents of Donora were experiencing a meteorological effect known as an air inversion. Normally, air temperature is warmer the lower the elevation, though when the ground temperature is cool enough or when a warm mass of air flows over a cooler mass, an air inversion is created. Pittsburgh, with its rivers and hills, is a likely place for such inversions, and they're not really uncommon phenomenon. In 1952, London, England would have a similar episode, albeit with a higher rate of fatality. What was uncommon in both London and Donora was how long these inversions lasted. And these inversions essentially make for stagnant airflow. So the fog was going nowhere, and the pollutants were continuing to build up in the atmosphere and drop down on the town where they were being breathed in. When the local doctors' offices and hospitals were filled, a hotel in town became an emergency hospital, with hearses from local funeral parlors doubling as ambulances. I heard a story from a man I spoke to in town that day 6 years ago, and he had heard it from another one of the older men in town, the mayor, I believe, who is in his mid-90s now. The man told me that there was a high school football game between Donora High School and Monongahela High School. It was held on Friday, the 29th. By this point in the crisis, visibility was pretty bad, but the football stadium was up on the hill, and it was a little easier to see. Apparently, you could see that something was going on, but the crowd would cheer whenever the whistle blew, and nobody really knew what the score was. And at one point, the announcer called over the PA. One of the boys on the field called him off the field and told him he needed to go home. He needed to run home. Apparently, one of his family believed his father had died. Monongahela High School beat Donora that day, and most everybody stayed at the game because few people were aware of how serious the situation around them was, despite the burning sulfuric air that burned their lungs and watered their eyes, and they were breathing every moment dangerous levels of nitrogen dioxide and fluorine. By Friday the 29th, townspeople were already petitioning the two main industries in town, the Donora Zinc Works and the American Steel Wire Company, a subsidiary U.S. Steel, to cease their operations until the fog had cleared. That evening's Halloween parade went on as scheduled, though few attended, and eyewitnesses reported that it could take an hour to walk the 5 blocks as you couldn't see your hand out in front of your face, especially in the lower parts of town, and people were being advised to keep their windows shut and their doors closed. I don't have a number of how many people actually participated in trick-or-treating. On Saturday the 30th, a prominent doctor was still making house calls, and he found his way through the streets by driving up with half the car on the curb. At this point, Saturday the 30th, 1948, at least 11 people were dead. The zinc works shut down on the morning of Sunday the 31st. That evening, rain started to come in, and with that, the fog began to lift as the inversion had started to move on. Donora Zinc Works started operations the following day, Monday. By this point, people were waking up to the realizations that at least 20 people in Donora had died, and between 6,000 and 7,000 people, half the town's population, had been stricken ill. Nearly 1,000 animals were reported dead, and many plants had wilted away, including the vegetation for nearly half a mile circling the zinc works. In the weeks following the smog lifting, roughly 50 more people would die, but they would not be legally tied to the smog itself. Investigations occurred, and although neither Zinc Works nor American Steel and Wire acknowledged their role their continued operations played in the health and environmental catastrophe, a settlement was reached by 1951, months before the other killer smog occurred in London, with over 1,000 people dying as a result. And a lot of speculation has been made about, well, if this incident in Donora had lasted just a couple more days, what would the fatalities look like? Regardless, the class action suit yielded little financially for those involved, and by 1957, Donora Zinc Works was closed down. U.S. Steel would cease its operations in Donora a few years later than that, and today, the population of the town has shrunk to roughly a third of what it was in 1948. Over the next decades, the Environmental Protection Agency was established, as well as the Clean Air Act of 1970, both in large part responding to the incident in Donora. I've been told that there's still a lingering health problem for the residents of Donora as a result of the mills and how lethal pollutants were pumped into the air and into the ground during the first half of the 20th century and the last 20 years of the 19th century. Donora is not unique in this respect, though, as this is fairly common amongst most towns of any size in the Pittsburgh area, but that's another story. Donora has baseball greats. It has Thomas Edison's Cement City. Up until a few months ago, it had a bridge on the National Historic Register, but that's since been imploded. But even if the town as a whole were to be razed tomorrow, it would still have the legacy of the smog. And you can still drive, as I did that day, on Route 837 and see bordering the town and the Monongahela River the remains of the industry that had choked out the town for the better part of 5 days in 1948. And if you have any suggestions, comments, pictures, anything, feel free to email at drpennsylvania@gmail.com.